Well, you saw him there and you see him here. Davey, who's the Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change and who's the Lib Dem candidate in Kingston and Surbiton. Welcome to you.
Thank you.
The charge there that everything's a little bit vague, but presumably that's intentional because you want to keep your options open for post-election negotiations.
I'd say I reject that charge. I mean, we increased the tax allowance to more than 10,000, as we promised at the last election, delivering a tax cut for 3.5 million Londoners. We're now saying we want to raise it to 12,500. On health spending, we're the only party talking about mental health as a key priority. On education, we're the only party who actually wants to increase spending on education, which didn't come out in your film. And we're the only party on the environment who's got 5 green laws specified in detail. So I think we do actually have both a manifesto that can be implemented, that's a very realistic one, and would prevent the Tories going off to the right and Labour going off to the left, but also has some very progressive ideas which would improve our country.
What about red lines for you?
Well, we've got our 5 priorities on the front page of our manifesto. We couldn't be clearer what our priorities are on balancing the books, on fairer taxes, on investment in education and health, and on our 5 green laws.
But is there anything particularly non-negotiable for you, from your experience out in southwest London the last few years, that you just feel you couldn't possibly negotiate, say, with the Conservatives about?
Well, we've made very clear all along in this government and the future government that education spending is a critical issue for us. The Tories came to us at the beginning of the last coalition. They wanted to slash spending per pupil in our schools, which would have been shocking. We would have seen teachers sacked, we'd have seen not been able to invest in our schools, and we stopped that. And one of the reasons why we're emphasising education spending, Nick Clegg's led on this, to make sure that we don't just protect funding for nursery schools and colleges, we get more money, is because of our successful policy of the pupil premium,
so
which has seen more money to disadvantaged pupils, which is going to help tackle social mobility issues and help the poorest in our society get on.
So you feel you've been quite a good break on their intentions these last few years? I mean, is there any areas where you feel you would have liked to be more of a break? You look back at this and you think you allowed the Conservatives to get away with anything?
Well, I think there were lots of arguments that we had in the coalition. I mean, in my area, in energy and climate change, the Tories didn't want the expansion of renewable electricity that we've seen. We've nearly trebled renewable electricity, and we had a massive increase in things like offshore wind, onshore wind and solar power. And Eric Pickles tried, and in 1 or 2 cases succeeded, in stopping us with that expansion. I think he was wrong. I think he's undermined investment.
So he tried, but they haven't really. So you've done pretty well. You think you've been a very good break on their excesses. Let's look at some other London issues. Look at transport, for instance. Are you happy that fares went up so considerably over, you know, most years of this Parliament? I mean, they've been frozen the last year, but...
Well, we fought for that freeze, actually. Liberal Democrats have always argued that we shouldn't see the big increases that happened under Labour, and, you know, we tried in the coalition to moderate them to some effect. We didn't get it all our own way, of course we didn't. But we've pushed, for example, on rail investment. We're seeing the biggest investment in our railways since the Victorians. We've seen Crossrail go ahead. Liberal Democrats are arguing for Crossrail 2 and for the extension of the...
the point being made, but because they're such important bits of infrastructure, you sort of, you know, you might have put them in your manifesto.
Well,
is that really another area you're not prepared to say? You can't even say which bits you favour in...
In your film, you criticise us for having the longest manifesto, and now you're saying we didn't put this or that in. Listen...
which is then probably about priorities, and it can be... but that's not mutually exclusive. It's long, but perhaps vague. We could have had more detail. But you're saying you do support Crossrail too. You support all those Bakerloo lines and so on. But in the last time, in 2010, you promised you were going to reduce fares by 1% below inflation, and we've seen them going up 2% of inflation. You haven't proved, you know, if people vote for you again as part of some kind of coalition with the Conservatives, they ain't going to get those fares frozen.
Well, let's look at what we achieved, because it's the flip side of that. We got 75% of our manifesto into the coalition agreement and implemented. 75%. In a coalition agreement, it's a negotiation. You don't get 100%. The Tories didn't get 100% of what they wanted.
No,
but that's called
and
coalition.
I suppose this is what we're asking, isn't it? Is whether, you know, did you prove to be great negotiators on...
Well, I think 75%, taking 3 million low paid out of income tax, delivering an £825 a year income tax cut for people on lower middle incomes was a tremendous success. I think the pupil premium, giving money to the most disadvantaged children, I think the increase in renewable electricity...
We've done with those.
Those sorts of things.
And Mark Littlewood in the film mentioned this as well, but let's just establish what's going on in terms of aviation. Would you now obviously contemplate and say it's possible that you'd accept the the expansion of Heathrow?
Well, our manifesto is clear. We don't believe there's a case for expanding airports in the southeast of London, that there is spare capacity. Moreover, that we should be focusing in on railway investment so we can displace a lot of the short-haul flights that we see.
And in that respect, your policy hasn't changed. So I think we could move on from that and find out, would you reject, is that a red line? You wouldn't reject coalition with the Conservatives if they suggest expanding Heathrow, would you?
Well, let's be clear. I'm not going to give our red lines. I don't think the other parties are doing, because the point is this. In a coalition negotiation, you don't want to show your hand. We've got very strong commitments to the environment. I've got a personal, I know people like Vince Cable got a very personal, very strongly held view that Heathrow should not expand.
But you'll accept that we can doubt. We can go into this election wondering how strong those commitments are, because after the election, it is quite possible, if Davis reports and recommends Heathrow expansion, that you guys now will go along with that. There's no point in being signed up to Davis if you don't do it, is there?
Well, we were very clear. We're the only party actually who's been so clear, I think the Greens possibly as well, that Heathrow should not expand. And what was very interesting, the Conservative manifesto, in 2010, they were against Heathrow expansion. They put it in their manifesto. Now they haven't put it.
But Heathrow expansion would not stop you. I think we've established that. You can't say at this stage. And also, your manifesto says something. Your manifesto says something slightly different this time.
That's about
OK, but your manifesto says something slightly different. Your first thing you just said to me was about expansion in the southeast. But your manifesto doesn't say that this time. It talks about no net increase in the UK as a whole, which has allowed you, does it not, looking at the words, allows you to accept an expansion in one of these airports, Gatwick or Heathrow, as long as there's a reduction somewhere else. Now, that's a shift, isn't it?
No. Our party's been very clear. We've debated this, unlike the other parties, twice at our conference, very clear that we don't see a case for expansion in the southeast, because we can take a lot of the flights that currently are short-haul onto the railways and create the extra space that is needed without seeing more runways.
You don't feel in the emphasis, the shift in emphasis in the words and where you focus on modern society, and we know that flights are needed, you have shifted in 5 years, and you're the climate change man.
Let me be really clear. We've been very strong on this in both our 2010 manifesto and our 2015 manifesto. The Tories don't even talk about this in their 2015 manifesto. And, you know, people like Zach Goldsmith and others who've campaigned against Heathrow expansion, I'll give them credit for that, they ought to be really worried about what their Tory manifesto is saying.
Would say, okay.
It undermines their position.
Let's move on to housing. Would you allow, it's another red line question, but, you know, we want to try and get some clarity. What do you think, would you allow the Conservatives to go ahead with this right-to-buy policy with housing association homes?
One of the reasons that we would be very strongly against it is because of the fraud we're seeing. It's not talked about very much, but because they're giving such huge discounts, there's a lot of fraud going on, even money laundering. And I think people need to look at this right to buy and how it's actually operating in practice. It's extraordinarily worrying what we're seeing in councils up and down the country, including in London. And to put that onto the housing associations, I mean, talk to the housing associations. They will say they won't be able to borrow, as they've been doing, to build new houses.
People can't fail to have picked up on how the policy has been going down. I'd like to know,
very badly.
Is that something that you would allow the Conservatives to go ahead with?
It would be something that we would dissuade them from, because it is extraordinarily bad for social housing. What we want to see is a lot more houses built in London and in the southeast. We've argued, for example, for 10 garden cities. We want to take the house building up from its current 150,000 to 300,000
And you think that would take the pressure out of the capital, right? And there's a recognition you haven't been able to get the kind of affordable homes in London that you promised or said you would last time.
Well, we've done a lot better than the last Labour government did. Actually, house building is now on the up. And if you link that to some of the other Liberal Democrat housing policies, for example, help to rent. We want to make sure that when people are struggling to get that deposit to be able to become a tenant, that they can get, particularly the first-time renters, that can be guaranteed.
How did you do much more than the Labour government did? The Labour government had left subsidy